I moved to Springfield, Missouri 30 years ago to become the senior minister of a large Christian church that had just harassed the former pastor into resignation after a very short tenure. The associate pastor, the administrator, the secretary, and the janitor all left at about the same time, fleeing what had become a toxic environment. I was foolishly confident that this would not happen to me. After all, I had served 3 other Disciples of Christ churches, and each time I had followed ministers who had been fired. And in each case, I managed to stay longer than my predecessors and left on my own terms. I was used to managing organized opposition, and I was cocky enough to believe that I could do it again. But when the same people who had needled my predecessor into leaving Springfield like a Domino's delivery driver with a 29-minute-old pizza started taking me out to dinner and trying to become my closest friends, the wise old chairman of the board took me out to lunch and gave me a bit of sage advice that I have never forgotten. He raised the topic of the time I was spending with the rump group that had managed to run off my previous pastor. I assured him that they seemed very friendly to me, they seemed to like me, and he just looked at me and said, "A snake does not have to bite you to be a snake." That advice has turned out to be one of the wisest and most important pieces of advice that I have ever been given. And every time that I have ignored it, eventually, I have been very, very sorry. One of the foundational truths of psychology is that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. We can be very narcissistic about these things. We all tend to interpret the universe from our own experience, judging everything as if it was nothing more than a flavor of ice cream or a style of music. One person likes vanilla, another likes Rocky Road, but it isn't that one of them is right and the other one is wrong. One person likes classic rock and the other likes country music, and maybe that illustration doesn't work as well. Clearly, people who like country music are just wrong. But you catch my drift. We want to believe that just because this person I'm very attracted to cheated on her first husband and then cheated on her second husband, that she will be faithful to me because she really loves me. This is not a horribly rational way of thinking. A snake doesn't have to bite you to be a snake. And yes, people can change. If I ever stop believing that, I really need to give up on preaching and counseling. People can change, but they rarely do. And when they do, it is because of a powerful and usually a very costly commitment to change. People don't change easily, we don't change quickly, and we usually don't change very much. We who discovered our spiritual lives within one of the major world religions, we all treasure the value of forgiveness, of mercy, of giving people second chances. But the same one who the Gospels tell us taught us to love our enemies also cautioned us not to cast our pearls before swine. Compassion is a primary value of spirituality, but that does not mean that a narcissist will not see your compassion as a weakness to be exploited. Get real. You are not some kind of Harry Potter snake whisperer. If you have seen a snake bite someone else, even if they've not bitten you yet, don't kid yourself. The famous Maya Angelou quote that has been repeated to the point of exhaustion is nonetheless true. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said that forgiveness without confession is cheap grace. But sociopaths, both narcissists and people with antisocial personality disorders, they don't confess anything sincerely. And they will lean on your spiritual instincts to be not only forgiving and accepting, but they want you to be downright amnesiacs, pretending that what you saw with your own eyes, what you heard with your own ears, what you experienced in your own flesh, either didn't happen at all, or if it did, it doesn't matter. Don't fall for that kind of gaslighting. In 1983, then President Ronald Reagan naively referred to the Soviet Union as being the evil empire. With much more wisdom and maturity of thought, the Russian novelist Alexander Solzhenitsyn replied, "If only it were so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of their own heart?" There's a paradox here. Now, I've spent upwards of 40 years talking about ethics, character, personal choices, and almost always with the binary assumption that good and evil do exist, and yet trying to simultaneously encourage people to suspend judgment, to be forgiving, to be tolerant and accepting, and if at all possible, even loving. I want to encourage the good in human potential and discourage the evil, and yet try very hard to fully acknowledge that that line between good and evil runs right through the middle of all of us. Rather than judging others, we preachers try to encourage people to examine themselves, to root out the evil in their own character, and try to fertilize and encourage their better traits. Ironically, the Michael Jackson song, "Man in the Mirror," in which he sings, "I'm starting with the man in the mirror. I'm asking him to change his ways. And no message could have been any clearer. If they want to make the world a better place, take a look at yourself and make a change." After it became unavoidably clear that Michael Jackson was guilty of child molesting, Sean asked me if it was still okay if we used that song in our services. And if you had to answer that question, what would you say? The message of the song is spot on. We want that kind of song in our services to make the world a better place. Focus on that person you see in the mirror every morning. But the artist who is famous for recording the message clearly hadn't done the most important changing that he desperately needed to do. So can I ignore that and use the music in a church service without some kind of disclaimer to put some distance between our church and a known pedophile? No one's perfect, no one's innocent. But how far does a person have to go down the path of imperfection and sin before they become, if not irredeemably evil, then at least predominantly evil? There's been an absolute plethora of science fiction movies in which time travel was possible, and they always seem to discuss the potential for going back in time and killing Hitler when he was a baby. In fact, I'm going to take it as proof that time travel is not possible, because if it was, someone would have gone back and killed baby Hitler. Since no one has ever shown up to do that, it stands to reason that it cannot be done. But we're not here to talk about time travel. My point is that some people are bad people, even if they have some redeeming qualities. We tend to think of them as being bad. And almost all of history's true heroes also have feet of clay. Many of our nation's founders, whose faces are chiseled in gigantic stone relief, were also slaveholders, womanizers, and self-dealing greedy people who also did a lot of good, if not downright brilliant things. Gandhi, near the end of his life, had teenage girls sleeping naked with him, what he called an experiment. Martin Luther King Jr. had dozens of affairs. One biographer found a tally of 43. He also abused alcohol and was often terribly egotistical. Dorothy Day's closest associates seemed to think that she was as much a narcissist as the rest of us thought of her as a saint. As awkward as it can be to have to be able to tell the difference between a Hitler and a Martin Luther King Jr., even though Hitler was a pretty good artist And Fidel Castro was a pretty good baseball player. But in balance, we don't remember Hitler as being a painter or Castro as being a pitcher, just as we do not remember Gandhi as being a predator or King as a philanderer. It's not always easy to categorize history's heroes and villains. Consider the fact that it's taken us nearly 200 years after the Trail of Tears to realize that Andrew Jackson was an absolutely horrible human being. We just recently stopped calling the annual Democratic Party rally here in Greene County, Missouri, Jackson Days. Now it's just called Democrat Days because they didn't have the confidence to name it after anybody who might turn out to not be an honorable person. But it took us 200 years to reach the point of recognizing that Andrew Jackson dueling, owning slaves, and promoting Indian genocide did not make him honorable. So we don't want to make that mistake again. So here's our paradox. We want to emphasize, as Gandhi famously suggested, that we embody in our own lives the changes that we want to see in the world. We don't try to make other people look like us. We want to change us to be better people and thereby to be an inspiration. We want to make the world a better place by focusing on that person staring back at us in the mirror every morning. We want to suspend judgment, be tolerant, be forgiving, be loving, but we don't want to pretend that ethics do not matter. I don't want to deny reality. As we always counsel the family members of addicts, don't try to act like you believe their lies. That doesn't help them. In fact, it enables them to continue abusing drugs and alcohol while they run through the family's resources, trying to gaslight everyone else into believing that they are somehow causing the addict's substance abuse. Let me say this clearly, and it doesn't feel good to hear a pastor say it, but there is no such thing as unconditional love. Your Sunday school teachers lied to you. If love were unconditional, then it would have to be entirely arbitrary. That would mean that we loved everyone the same. I would have no reason, for example, to love my daughter more than I love a total stranger walking down the sidewalk. That's too absurd to even consider. I obviously love my daughter more than I love strangers. That doesn't mean I hate strangers. It just means that I do not award them a place in my heart, in my home, in my last will and testament that is equal to the place that my daughter holds. You may be forgiving, tolerant, and generous, but love always happens within a behavioral context. If you continue to love and support a violently abusive spouse, that doesn't make you a saint. In fact, it means that there's at least 2 sick people living in your house. We've all had close friends with whom we've had a falling out. People like me try to discourage that. We talk about reconciliation and tolerance and forgiveness. But there are ways and times when people can cross a line. Sometimes, to an outside observer, the line can seem silly or indefensible. But we all have a line in every relationship that represents our boundaries of just how much bad stuff they can put into a relationship before we decide that we need to end the relationship, whether that's a marriage or a friendship or even a parent and child relationship. If you'll give me permission to say this in a very crude way, a way that hopefully will make it easy for you to remember, after many years of doing both individual and family counseling, I concluded that just about everyone on earth will be just as much of an asshole as the people around them will allow them to be. I haven't patented it yet or copyrighted it, but one day psychologists and sociologists will discuss Roger Ray's asshole theory. What keeps almost any of us from becoming emotional terrorists and manipulative monsters is because we have people in our lives who push back. An employer, a spouse, parents, who won't let us get away with being dishonest or acting entitled, arrogant, or abusive. The famous psychiatrist M. Scott Peck said that the only reason to get married is for the friction. And you should know that in spite of his brilliant writing and teaching, by his own admission, I've heard him say it, Peck was deeply flawed. He had myriad psychosomatic illnesses. He smoked, he drank alcoholically, and worst of all, he was a serial philanderer and an awful husband. But God only knows what a miserable human being he would have been without Lily, who spent most of her life with Scott Peck trying to keep him from being a complete asshole. The point of my theory is not that you need to be able to label someone a snake and then remove them from your life forever. It says everyone will be just as much of an asshole as the people around them will allow them to be. Don't ignore it when someone you care about is being abusive to someone else. I'm indebted to the comedian Dave Barry for this salient observation, that if the person you are with is nice to you but rude to the waiter, the person you are with is not a nice person. For example, my daughter is beautiful, she's intelligent, she's popular, but during her early adolescence as a middle school and high school cheerleader, I repeatedly had to emphasize to her that even though she is beautiful and intelligent and popular, that there is no excuse for being rude or dismissive of people who are less intelligent, less attractive, or less popular, especially if that person is her father. Scott Peck wrote a book about human evil, The People of the Lie. But in the introduction to the book, he warned that the book itself might be evil if people used it to label everyone who simply annoyed them or who disagreed with them or rubbed them the wrong way as being evil. I emphatically believe that we do have to push back on family members and friends and coworkers and those who sit in the pews with us and those with whom we serve on community organizations. Because, folks, racism is not acceptable. We should not tolerate homophobia. Poverty in the presence of wealth is a sin, straight up. You can love someone while not ignoring their addictions, their abuse, their narcissism, or dishonesty. In fact, we only become better people if our peer group has some moral expectations of us. Most of us will live down to the lowest expectations that are placed on us. It's not unlike our standards in the world of academics. You may be one of the smartest, most innovative researchers, writers, scientists, inventors, but if your work has not been exposed to peer review, critical thinkers are not going to pay much attention to you. I don't want to name names, but some of my favorite scholars became too self-confident in the later part of their careers and began to publish books that they had not shopped around to professional peers. And they ended up publishing what is rubbish, really. No one less than Sigmund Freud, in a letter to a friend in 1889, said, "I have examined myself thoroughly and have come to the conclusion that I don't need to change much." I suspect that even his beloved daughter, Anna, would have had something to say about that. If you have not recently apologized for something you've said or done, if at this very moment you cannot think of something about your character that could stand some correction or improvement, then you too may be a malignant narcissist. When humans mostly lived in small tribes and villages, you could not easily escape those who would give you a good peer review, maybe more often than you wanted. No one would have gotten away with saying that they had thoroughly examined themselves and found that they didn't need to change much in a small village. But now few of us live anywhere near the place where we were born. We are not surrounded by people who have known us our whole lives. Friendships come and go. We change careers, we change neighborhoods, we move from state to state. We can be isolated or in a self-selected group of associations who never provide the kind of friction that we need to be sincerely self-critical. Now we have to choose to be in community, and we have to choose to be vulnerable enough to both invite and to accept criticism seriously. And you cannot turn a blind eye or simply ignore egregious moral failings in the people that you love. A snake doesn't have to bite you to be a snake. But maybe that person doesn't really want to be a snake. Maybe they need for you to love them enough to encourage them to become their best selves. Although no one has ever actually seen a dragon, virtually every human culture in every century has an image of a mythological dragon. Jung speculated that dragons are an archetype of our unconscious reflection on our own potential. A dragon is, after all, a snake that can fly. And that, men and women, is all of us. As Solzhenitsyn correctly observed, the line between good and evil runs right through the middle of us. We all have the potential to be a snake. We also have the potential to soar like angels. Most days, we will have done some of both. Every day, we should be self-aware enough to try harder to soar more than we slither.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.